Hello. I have never shied away from my contentions, concerns, and frankly frustration with woke ideology and certain aspects of the contemporary society that we're in. But in the interest of balance, and in the interest of truth, and in the interest of just what's on my mind, I want to use this video for a more optimistic message. Now, I stand by everything I said on those things. I don't take any of it back. But I wouldn't want to give the impression that I'm totally cynical and totally negative about the whole of modern society. That isn't the case. So I want to use this video to just think a little bit about some of the things I think are good and positive and better about modern society versus the past. Um, First of all, notwithstanding the aforementioned ideology, which I don't think is tolerant, society, I think, is a lot more tolerant. So if you are, I'm thinking particularly here about the UK, if you're gay, if you're black, um, if you are any sort of visible minority in Britain today, you will generally be in a better position than you would have been in the past. So let's just break this down a bit. For gay men, I have a close friend, very close friend. He's one of my best friends who is gay, and he's an effeminate gay man. And sometimes we've had this discussion, and I'd say, well, do you think things have improved now? Because obviously I'm straight, I can't directly experience that. And he acknowledges that things have definitely got better. The Wilson government decriminalised homosexuality. That was one of the good things that administration done, in my opinion. Um, it is true that not everything happened at once. So it's only very recently, in fact, it's only in the last few weeks, which is pretty disgraceful actually, that service personnel who were unfairly dismissed for being gay were, had all their honours restored, and there was no sort of notion that they'd done anything wrong other than have their sexual orientation. Now, the armed forces today, like wider society, has moved with the times. Um, it's no longer a bar to joining the armed forces as long as you pass all the medicals and so on. That's a good thing because someone who's gay or a lesbian shouldn't feel that they cannot serve their country just because of their sexual orientation. And I think in Britain also transgender people. So that's a good thing. I think if people, so long as it's a level playing field, and they pass the security checks and all, that's a good thing. And those people should not be stigmatized for that. So that's an area where we've come a long way, I think. Yes, there is still homophobia in society, but it's now seen rightfully for what it is, bigotry. Um, so that's an area we've definitely come a long way. In the past, tough northern industrial towns like Sunderland, as it then was a town, wouldn't have been the most comfortable place to be an openly gay man, say in the 1970s or 60s, because, these were industrial centres. They were quite, I don't want to say macho, that's the wrong word, but, they were socially traditional in that sense. So I think that's something that's definitely welcome. Gay marriage is something that the Cameron administration brought in. I think that's justified. Why shouldn't uh, gay men and lesbian women be given a level playing field to express their love? I do think in the case of churches, that's a slightly different issue because that's about the sovereignty of faith within a religious building. But the general principle of allowing gay marriage, I think, is an important one. Um, we have also come a long way in terms of race relations. And this is why I was so critical of some of the things that were going on last year, because I genuinely think they were bringing us back or trying to bring us back. Um, there was a time in this country when the National Front were literally terrorizing South Asian people, black people. If you've seen the film Made in Britain, that isn't far off the mark. That is the sort of mentality that was around in the 70s and 80s and probably up to the 90s. That's not to say there aren't racists in society. There are still some very unpleasant far right groups like Combat 18 and other extremist white nationalist type groups. But I would argue British society has come a long way. Now, there's a debate over, old 70s sitcoms, should they be cancelled because they're politically incorrect, the sort of language that's used by today's standards, for example, Love Thy Neighbour. Um, but I think it's important to look at those in the context of the time. And actually, in that specific example, Love Thy Neighbour, the language was extremely racist, there's no question about it. But the joke was always on the racist, it wasn't on um, the black character. He also the actor was also in EastEnders. Forget the guy's name now. But that was it's an example of how society changes. So today, racism still exists. I'm by no means saying it doesn't, but I would say that wider society shuns it in a way that we didn't necessarily in the past. The times when there was pub signs saying no blacks and no Irish, thankfully those days are long gone because it's discriminatory, obviously. Um, and it should be illegal. If you're running a public business, it's I don't think it's enough to say, well, it's my business. If your whole thing is pitching for public custom and you're discriminating against one segment of society, then you should be shunned, quite frankly. Unless there's a very, very, very good reason for it. For example, maybe, well, actually, I don't even know if there is a good reason for banning any demographic. But maybe items of clothing, hoodies, and so on, that's fair enough. But in that sense, we've come a long way. And that is a very, very good thing because, I've had my share of bigotry because of my accent. It was unpleasant at times. I was even physically attacked a few times. But I really do think that wider society has come a long way. In my case, it was, if you've got a Ulster accent, then, oh, well, you must be in the IRA, you must be a terrorist. So I did get quite a rough time, if I'm being honest, when I first came to England. But, it's ancient history now. I mean, I'm talking literally 20 years ago. Um, so those attitudes do exist, but they are, I feel, in the minority now. And I do think it's important that there is legal protection against discrimination. I think that's a good thing. A lot of that was brought in by the Blair government, and I think that's good. I think it's one of the achievements of that government to guarantee that people would not be discriminated on though in those areas. And I'm not just saying it was that government. There was also previous governments that brought in various legislation. Now, one could argue, for example, hate crime bills go too far. I do think they need to be strongly scrutinised. However, the principle is there that no one should be discriminated against because of their gender. And when it does happen, people can bring legal cases. There's even now been a few cases where white men have brought cases, and I say good for them. I hope they get justice because it should be a level playing field. But that's definitely something I think is welcome. Um, there are certain forms of punishment that are long gone in our society. Now, I'm conservative on crime. I think if you hurt society, you should pay a price. But long, long gone are the days that we had the pillory, the stocks, public hangings. These were actually quite brutal things. In the case of public hangings, actually, crime increased because the sheer size of the crowds. I mean, it was pretty barbaric when you think about it. Charles Dickens wrote about this. The last public execution in this country was 1868. So we're talking now 153 years ago. Michael Barrett, who was a Fenian Brotherhood member and had been implicated in the Clerkenwell bombing, terrible crime. But public executions were brutal, brutal things, especially when they were botched. Um, and we had the last execution of any kind, in that case, private behind prison walls without a crowd in 1964. And then finally, I think it was taken off the statute in England and Wales in 1968. And finally, across the United Kingdom by the 1990s. I think there was a case, it was either Northern Ireland or the Isle of Man, where someone was sentenced to death in the early 90s, but realistically, that was never going to be carried out. Now, my gut feeling about the death penalty is it belongs in the past. I think for the worst of the worst, lock them up, never release, child killers and the very worst criminals. But I do feel that it's something that belongs in the past. The majority of countries in the world today don't have the death penalty. Even countries with poor human rights records like Russia don't have the death penalty. That's very important. The trajectory has been against it, and we, in my view, are on the right side of history in that regard. I think we need tougher punishments for a lot of crimes, but not the death penalty, and that's in the past. Um, and things like the pillory. If anyone's seen the series Garrow's Law, it was a great series. It was about the lawyer William Garrow in the 18th century, who is associated with the concept of innocent until proven guilty. That was a very good series because it really showed the insight into law and crime in Georgian London, and it was brutal stuff. I mean, to be put in the pillory for hours if you weren't killed by the mob, basically. It was a very cruel punishment. And then going further back, of course, we had people burned at the stake, even boiled alive under Henry VIII's reign. They were barbaric punishments that could rival any dictator today. So, that is further and further back in time now. That's a good thing. Our attitude to human rights, I think, is generally improved over time. We cannot always say that we were great arbiters of human rights. Even today, we're not perfect. But I think the principle in the British mindset very much is there. We believe in freedom of speech. We believe in egalitarianism. We believe in the basic principles of human rights. There may be some dispute over how exactly it's implemented, but I think, I've great faith in the British people. I think we are a generous nation and a generous people, and I think that's something to welcome. Definitely, that we definitely don't have an attitude where torture is okay or people should be locked up for having an opinion. And when there are signs of bills that are very contentious, and there is a big public backlash against it. So I'm optimistic about that. I think that's a good thing that there is that public mindset that is in the right place. Um, there's probably a lot of other things to look at. Social media. I've been critical of elements of social media. I don't like the way big tech giants like YouTube and Facebook, and this is spanning outside the UK now, have the sheer amount of control they have and the way, in my case, they push creators into a corner. However, however, we do have to look at the positive things about it. With Facebook, for example, is a way of keeping in touch with friends around the world and family members that wouldn't have been so easy in the past. In the past, there would have been emails and phone calls, which would have cost the earth because they were long distance. They, for free, you could just message someone on Facebook as long as they have a VPN. So keeping people in touch is one of the great things about social media. Um, it's also been an important tool, I think, in people power. Spreading awareness of human rights, spreading awareness of popular uprisings against autocrats. There is a lot of positive things about social media, but when we look at it, we need to, be balanced about it. It's not all bad. And of course, is the tools of it. Like I couldn't be doing this without social media, without specifically YouTube. So that's a good thing. I'm sharing my thoughts, and people are watching these videos, so that's a good thing. Medicine's advanced greatly across the board, notwithstanding this terrible pandemic that we're going through. Just basic medicine has greatly improved, at least in at least in developed countries. Even if we look at the armed forces, war zones, injuries that soldiers would have today, in the past they would have died from on the battlefield. I mean, if you look at pretty much any conflict, probably before the Second World War, the number of military personnel who died from injuries, from disease, was staggering. I mean, medieval warfare, probably two-thirds, three-quarters even of all deaths in conflict were from disease. So that's an area that's improved greatly. That doesn't mean that there aren't still terrible injuries and soldiers don't still need serious mental health treatment and so on, but I think it has improved greatly. Um, that's another area I think we've improved on, understanding and sympathy with mental health issues. To give an example, in the past when we had a big disaster such as a big train crash, like take for example a Harrow train crash of 1952, 53, I think it was 52. In those days, there was no concept of treating post-traumatic stress disorder. They did know by that point shell shock after the First World War. That was starting to be a bit more understood. But even by the Second World War, it wasn't totally understood and it wasn't totally respected in the same way as a serious condition. Um, but if you were involved in a disaster, what would happen is you would get treated for your wounds. Maybe a priest would say last rites to those who were dying, but that would pretty much be it. There would be maybe the community would pull together. People often say community spirit was better in the past. I'm not sure about that. I think there's been good community spirit during this pandemic, but that would be it. Today, we understand a lot more about clinical depression, about uh, PTSD. We understand these things a lot more. Um, and you get high profile people such as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have brought awareness of this. That's a good thing. So I think the fact that we are more compassionate about things and like that is something to welcome. So in many ways, society is more compassionate than the past. You know, in the past, it would just be like man up or, you know, pull yourself together. There would be a lack of understanding of just how deep that would be. Even areas like autism and learning difficulties and so on, children who suffer dyslexia in the past, it would just be like they were seen as, to put it bluntly, and apologies here for using this language, but they would be seen as dunces, which of course wasn't fair. Um, so I think when we look across the board, there are a lot of things that have improved. Um, we are in many ways a fairer society, a more tolerant society, um, and a more compassionate society. There are things that arguably have got worse, but I don't want to focus on those for this video. Let's just focus on the positive. A lot of things have improved. Um, even there's probably a lot of things I haven't even covered. If I've left anything out, feel free to add a few things to this. But it's a cause for optimism. My generation, millennials, we have been through a very interesting time because we're the last generation that remembers the pre-social media age, but we're also the new generation that saw the introduction of all of that. So I'm quite happy to be a millennial. Although I don't agree with every direction, that may be the trajectory of my generation. We're a big generation, and you cannot say all millennials are the same. We are a big generation. We have a voice, and frankly, I'm proud to be a millennial. So let me know your thoughts. Feel free to add to anything here that I haven't included.